It seems like everywhere you look these days, it's all about going green, right?
Yeah.
Electric cars, solar panels, wind farms. It's really exciting to see this push towards a cleaner energy future gaining so much momentum. But
Yeah.
uh, have you ever stopped to think about what's actually driving this massive transformation? Like, at its core, what materials are actually enabling all of this to happen?
That's such a good point. We get caught up in the technology and the big picture, but the raw materials are easy to overlook.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to dive into today. We're going to zoom in on one crucial element that underpins so much of this green revolution: lithium. And you sent us a really fascinating research paper. It's titled Assessment of Lithium Criticality in the Global Energy Transition and Addressing Policy Gaps in Transportation. And it really digs deep into the nitty-gritty of this whole lithium situation.
It's a pretty comprehensive study. The authors, Peter Grime, A.A. Solomon, and Christian Breyer, they come from LUT University and the University of Augsburg. And one of the things I really appreciate about their approach is that they've developed a bunch of different scenarios, actually 18 in total.
Wow, 18, okay.
Yeah, they've combined, different projections for energy demand and transportation demand with varying estimates of lithium supply. So they're really trying to get a handle on the long-term availability of lithium, specifically for those rechargeable batteries that are really the heart of, this whole renewable energy future we're talking about.
Absolutely. And the key question they're trying to answer, the one we're going to try to unpack today,
Hmm.
is whether the supply of lithium itself could actually become a roadblock. Is it a potential bottleneck? Could it actually slow down, maybe even derail our efforts to build a truly sustainable energy system?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. And that's precisely what we're going to explore in this deep dive. We want to pull out the most important insights from this research on lithium criticality in the global energy transition, right? To help all of you listening understand the potential challenges that might lie ahead and the steps we might need to take to overcome them. And we're doing it all through the lens of this one element, lithium, this seemingly tiny but incredibly powerful element. So the paper really hones in on lithium-ion batteries. Those are batteries that are in our phones, laptops, electric cars. Could you explain why lithium is so indispensable for these batteries, especially as we're transitioning towards cleaner energy?
Sure. Lithium is crucial because it has these unique properties, right? Properties that make it perfect for what's called electrochemical energy storage. And that's basically what a battery does. It stores energy chemically. And lithium-ion batteries, or LIBs as they're often called, are kind of the gold standard at the moment. They're the leading technology for storing electrical energy, and this is critical for two really big areas that are driving this whole energy transition. The first one is stationary grid applications, and the second one is for, powering electric vehicles.
Okay, so break that down for me. When you say stationary grid applications, what exactly do you mean?
Basically, imagine giant battery farms. These massive batteries can store energy from those intermittent renewable sources, like solar power. It's only generated when the sun's shining, or wind power, you only get it when the wind's blowing. So these batteries, they kind of smooth things out, make the grid more stable and reliable, even when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing.
It's like a buffer for the renewable energy system.
Precisely. It helps us make the most of those renewable sources, even when they're not actively generating power. Now, the second area where libs are really making a splash is in battery electric vehicles. BEVs, the electric cars we're seeing more and more of on the roads.
Right. And that's a huge part of decarbonizing transportation, getting those gas guzzlers off the road.
Exactly. And, the growth in this whole lithium-ion battery market has been pretty astounding.
The numbers are mind-boggling, aren't they? I remember reading in the Lithium Criticality paper that between 2015 and 2018, the market had a compound annual growth rate of 24%. That's a massive expansion in just a few years.
It really is. And what's even more interesting, what this lithium criticality paper highlights, is the shift in where these batteries are being used. Back in 2018, 70% of all LIBE shipments went towards electric vehicles, mainly electric cars. And that was up from just 43% in 2015.
Wow. So it seems like the demand for lithium is increasingly being driven by, well, our desire for electric cars.
Yeah, pretty much. And this lithium criticality paper projects that this trend will continue, even accelerate. They're saying that the annual demand growth for lithium in automotive applications could go above 30% leading up to 2030.
That's a huge jump. And it's not just about the number of electric cars being sold, right? It's also about the sheer number of batteries that companies are planning to produce. The lithium criticality paper mentions over 1.2 terawatt hours of production capacity by 2030. That's a mind-blowing amount of batteries.
Right.
What's fueling this massive surge in manufacturing?
Well, the lithium criticality paper points to two key drivers. First off, the price of lithium-ion battery packs has dropped dramatically. Back in 2014, they were around $300 USD per kilowatt hour, but by the end of 2018, they'd fallen to $176.
Okay, so almost half the price in just a few years.
Exactly. And the projections suggest that the price will continue to fall. The second driver is what's known as the learning or experience curve. It basically means that as we produce more batteries, we get better and more efficient at it, which further drives down the cost.
It's like a positive feedback loop. The more we make, the cheaper it gets.
Precisely. The study actually cites cost improvements of around 16% for every doubling of cumulative production capacity. So the more we scale up production, the more economically viable lithium-ion batteries become. This means that more people can afford electric vehicles, which in turn drives demand for more batteries, and the cycle continues.
So we've established that lithium is absolutely central to this energy transition, and the demand for it is skyrocketing, largely thanks to the electric vehicle boom. Let's get into the specifics of that demand as laid out in the Lithium Criticality paper. What kind of numbers are we talking about, both now and in the future?
So back in 2015, the global demand for lithium was about 34.6 kilotons. But what's really interesting is how that demand was split across different uses. EVs accounted for about 14%. Stationary energy storage was a tiny sliver at around 1%. Traditional batteries, like the ones in our electronics, made up 25%. And then everything else, the non-battery applications of lithium, like in ceramics and lubricants, was the biggest chunk at 60%.
But I'm guessing that distribution has changed quite a bit since then, hasn't it? Especially with the rise of EVs.
You got it. The lithium criticality paper highlights that by 2019, battery applications had already overtaken that 60% mark. Basically, the increasing use of batteries, especially in electric cars, had flipped the script on what lithium is primarily used for.
So batteries are king now. What is the Lithium Criticality paper project for the future? How much more battery capacity are we going to need?
Well, they estimate that we'll need a substantial increase in stationary battery capacity, mainly to support the power grid. They're talking about something like 47.8 terawatt hours of capacity by 2050 and potentially even 200 terawatt hours by the year 2100.
Wow, those are some big numbers.
Yeah, they are. And this growth is directly tied to a couple of key factors. First, we're expecting to see much greater integration of renewable energy sources like solar and wind. These sources are intermittent, as we discussed, which means we need more storage to balance things out. Second, global energy demand is projected to rise, driven by population growth and rising living standards, which puts even more pressure on the need for storage capacity.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, what about all those batteries that are in electric vehicles? Once they reach the end of their life in a car, are they just recycled?
Well, the lithium criticality paper makes an interesting assumption here. They assume that those EV batteries will actually have a second life in stationary energy storage applications. So instead of going straight to recycling, they'll be repurposed for use in those large battery farms we talked about.
Oh, that's clever. So it's like extending the lifespan of those batteries, getting more bang for our buck, so to speak.
Exactly, and that significantly impacts their projections for lithium demand. They're modeling these batteries having a lifespan of about 8 years in an EV, followed by another 8 years in a stationary role. So one battery could potentially be in use for 16 years.
That's pretty impressive. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the overall number of vehicles on the road. I recall the paper mentioned a projected increase in light-duty vehicles globally.
You're right. The lithium criticality paper highlights a projected jump from about 1 billion light-duty vehicles in 2016 to a potential 3.05 billion by 2050. That's a lot more cars, trucks, and SUVs on the road.
That's a pretty significant increase, and of course, the big question is what percentage of those will be electric vehicles?
Right, that's the crux of it. The study actually considers two main sets of projections for the market share of EVs.
Ah, okay, so two different scenarios for EV adoption. What's the difference between them?
The first one is what you might call the more aggressive or optimistic outlook. It envisions a rapid, almost S-curve-like adoption of EVs. This is based on the idea that governments will enact strong policies to encourage EV uptake, and there'll be strong societal pressure to decarbonize transportation quickly. Some of these projections even see global EV sales hitting 40% to 50% by 2030, and maybe even 100% by 2050 in some cases.
Wow, so a complete transition to electric vehicles within just a few decades. What about the second set of projections?
The second set, which the lithium criticality paper focuses on, is more conservative. It ties the rate of EV adoption to things like the rollout of charging infrastructure, how quickly battery technology improves, and the pace of changes in regulations. These projections are more moderate. They see global EV sales maybe reaching around 33% by 2030 and 65% by 2050.
Got it. So a slower but still significant transition. Now, the lithium criticality papers specifically use its own scenarios, right? They have the best policy scenarios and the current policy scenarios. Can you remind us what those are based on?
Right. So their best policy scenarios assume that EV sales will make up 49% of all sales by 2030 and 86% by 2050. These are, ambitious targets, but the authors believe they're in line with the kind of action needed to limit global warming to around 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the goal that many scientists and policymakers are aiming for.
Right, keeping those temperature rises in check. And what about the current policy scenarios?
Those are more in line with the policies and trends that are already in place. They assume EV sales shares of 33% by 2030 and 65% by 2050. So still significant growth, but not as rapid as the best policy scenarios. Importantly, these projected sales shares are then translated into effective EV penetration rates. This takes into account not just fully battery electric vehicles, but also plug-in hybrid vehicles.
So they're factoring in all the different types of electric vehicles on the road. To get a handle on the total lithium demand from all those vehicles, they must make some assumptions about the size of those batteries and how long they'll last. What do they use for those factors in their calculations?
The lithium criticality paper assumes an average battery capacity of 60 kilowatt hours for a fully electric vehicle and 15 kilowatt hours for a plug-in hybrid. They also figure that each battery will have a lifespan of 8 years in a vehicle, followed by another 8 years in a second life stationary storage application. So a total of 16 years of use.
That's a pretty long life for a battery.
It is. It shows how much battery technology has advanced in recent years. Oh, and one more thing. They also briefly consider the growing use of batteries in other types of transport, like buses, trucks, and even electric bikes. They project that by 2100, those applications will demand an average of 50 terawatt hours of battery capacity.
So it's not just about cars and trucks, it's about electrifying all forms of transportation.
Okay, one last question before we move on to the supply side. How much lithium is actually in one of these batteries? What's the lithium intensity that the lithium criticality paper uses in its analysis? They use a long-term estimate of about 130 grams of lithium per kilowatt hour of battery capacity. The authors point out that this is on the lower end of what other studies have found, and they also factor in the continued growth of non-battery uses of lithium. They assume these uses will grow at about 3% per year, and other battery-related industrial uses will grow at 2% annually.
So they're really trying to capture the full picture of lithium demand, not just for batteries. Okay, so we've painted a pretty clear picture of the demand side, and it's one of significant and sustained growth. Now let's flip the coin and talk about the supply of lithium. Where does it come from, and how much of it is actually out there?
Well, back in 2016, the global supply of lithium was around 38 kilotons. And as the lithium criticality paper explains, lithium is a highly reactive element. It doesn't just exist in its pure form in nature. It's usually found in ionic compounds, either in mineral ores or dissolved in salt solutions called brines that are found underground.
So two main sources,
Right.
rocks and brines.
Exactly. And these two sources require different extraction methods, and they have different costs and production timelines. The lithium criticality paper also mentions that, there's a ton of lithium in seawater, but the technology to extract it is still not cost-effective for large-scale use.
So for their analysis, they focused on the lithium resources that we can actually extract economically. What's the overall estimate for those global lithium resources?
The U.S. Geological Survey, which the lithium criticality paper cites, estimates that the total global lithium resources are around 80 million tons. But here's the thing. The authors point out that there's a big range in resource estimates, depending on which study you look at. Some estimates are as low as 30 million tons, while others go up to 95 million tons.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It is, and it highlights how much uncertainty there is about how much lithium is really out there. To account for this uncertainty, the lithium criticality study uses 4 different lithium supply scenarios. A low resource scenario with 26 million tons, a medium scenario with 41 million tons, a high scenario with 56 million tons, and a very high scenario with 73 million tons. The lowest one is roughly in line with what we know are proven reserves, while the higher ones include potential extractable deposits.
Okay, so a wide range of possibilities. And I'm guessing the lower the estimate, the sooner we might run into trouble.
Absolutely. It really changes the timeline. And it's not just about the total amount of lithium, it's also about how easy and cheap it is to get it out of the ground.
Right, the economics of extraction.
Mm.
And the lithium criticality paper talks about something called cumulative availability curves. Can you explain what those are and how they relate to lithium supply?
So imagine you're trying to extract lithium. You're going to go for the easiest and cheapest deposits first, right? Makes sense. The cumulative availability curve basically shows you how much lithium becomes available at different extraction costs.
So like a supply curve?
Yeah, kind of. And generally, the lithium from brine deposits tends to be cheaper to produce than the lithium from those hard rock mineral ores.
So those brine deposits are crucial.
They are. Especially the ones in South America, they play a big role in how long those lower cost resources will last. But here's the good news. The lithium criticality paper notes that with the current market price for lithium carbonate, which is kind of the benchmark for lithium pricing, most conventional lithium deposits are now economically viable.
So at least for now, price isn't the biggest barrier to getting more lithium out of the ground.
Right, but the thing is, even if the price is right, it still takes time to bring new lithium sources into production, and that's a crucial factor when we're thinking about future supply.
Time is of the essence.
Exactly. The lithium criticality paper really emphasizes this point. They say that developing new lithium mines or extraction operations, what they call greenfield projects, usually takes 1 to 2 decades.
Wow, 1 to 2 decades. That's a long time.
It is. From the initial discovery of the deposit to actually getting the lithium out of the ground, it can take a really long time. Even extracting lithium from brines, which is generally faster than mining hard rock, takes 1 to 2 years just for the evaporation process. And that process relies on solar energy, so you're at the mercy of the weather.
So we can't just snap our fingers and have more lithium ready to go. It takes planning and time.
Absolutely. It's a slow and complex process.
Okay, so I've got this picture of rapidly increasing demand and a finite and somewhat uncertain supply of lithium. This leads us to the heart of the lithium criticality paper. What happens when we put supply and demand together? What did they find when they looked at the balance between these two forces across all their different scenarios?
Well, one of the key takeaways is that in the near term, maybe for the next decade or so, the supply and demand for lithium seem to be fairly balanced. Assuming, of course, that we have moderate levels of lithium production and that we don't see some crazy spike in demand.
So we're okay for now.
It seems that way. But as we look further out towards 2030 and beyond, things get a bit trickier. The balance starts to become much more sensitive to the specific demand scenario that plays out. For instance, if EV adoption really takes off, as many people expect, the demand for lithium could outstrip supply.
So the more successful we are at transitioning to electric vehicles, the bigger the lithium challenge becomes. It's a bit of a catch-22.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And this is where those different scenarios come into play. The lithium criticality paper explores a range of possibilities, from rapid EV adoption to slower, more gradual uptake.
And what does the paper say about the longer-term outlook, particularly under those best policy scenarios where electric vehicle become the dominant form of transportation?
Well, under those scenarios, the study indicates that we might be okay until around 2050. But beyond that point, especially in the latter half of the century, a significant deficit starts to emerge. They're saying that even with increased recycling, we might not have enough lithium to meet the growing demand.
So even if we do everything right, we might still hit a lithium wall.
That's what the study suggests. It's a real concern. And they also looked at scenarios with lower overall demand for lithium, and in those cases, they found that there might actually be surpluses in the near term. But they caution that those surpluses could lead to shortages later on if we don't manage production carefully.
It's a complex dynamic, isn't it?
It is. There are a lot of moving parts. And the lithium criticality paper highlights the importance of factors like recycling and battery lifespan. They say that having really efficient systems for recycling lithium from old batteries is absolutely crucial to avoid those early shortages and to make the most of the lithium we already have.
Recycling is key.
Absolutely. And so is making batteries that last longer. Things like vehicle-to-grid integration, where EV batteries can actually feed power back into the grid, can also help reduce the demand for new lithium.
So it's not just about mining more lithium. It's about using the lithium we have more efficiently. And those different estimates we talked about earlier for the total amount of lithium resources, how do those impact the supply-demand outlook?
Well, the paper's Figure 3C specifically addresses that. If we're working with the lower resource estimates, we could be looking at continuous supply deficits for the rest of this century. On the other hand, if the higher estimates are correct, we might actually see periods of surplus around the middle of the century. But even then, it's a temporary reprieve.
So knowing how much lithium is actually out there is crucial for making accurate projections.
It really is, and unfortunately, there's still a lot of uncertainty around those estimates.
Okay, so when we take a step back and look at the whole century, as the lithium criticality paper does, what's the big picture message about lithium availability?
Well, their analysis suggests that under most of the scenarios they considered, we're likely to face a lithium constraint at some point in this century. The only scenario where we might be okay is that very high resource scenario, where we have way more lithium than we currently think. But that's a big if.
Not the most optimistic outlook.
It highlights the need for action. And the paper even estimates how long it might be before we deplete different levels of lithium resources, which is pretty sobering. The lower the resource estimate, the sooner we hit that depletion point, and then we're in trouble.
I see. To get a clearer picture of how lithium actually moves through the system, the paper includes what they call a material flow analysis, right? What does that tell us?
Basically, they track where the lithium goes. So under one of the best policy scenarios, you see that a lot of the new lithium goes into making batteries for electric vehicles and other transportation applications. Then, a big chunk of those batteries gets a second life in stationary energy storage. And finally, all those batteries that reach the end of their life, whether it's their first or second life, go into the recycling process.
So it's like a circular economy for lithium.
Exactly. They're trying to keep the lithium in the loop for as long as possible.
And what about the actual quantities? How much lithium are we talking about in total?
In that particular scenario, they estimate that by 2100, we'll have used about 68 million tons of fresh lithium. And by that same year, they project that about 51 million tons of lithium will be in use, either in vehicles or stationary storage. But here's the catch. They also estimate that about 16.7 million tons of lithium will be lost by 2100.
Lost. How does that happen?
Well, it's a combination of things. Some lithium is lost during the recycling process, some is used in industrial applications where it's not easily recovered, and some is just plain lost due to inefficiencies in collecting and handling old batteries.
So we're not perfect at capturing all the lithium.
Not yet. And that's why the paper really stresses the importance of having super efficient recycling systems. They even say that if we don't get better at recycling, we could be looking at huge supply deficits by the end of the century.
So recycling is more than just a good idea. It's essential for a sustainable lithium future.
Exactly.
Okay, so all of this analysis has some pretty significant implications for policymakers. What are the main takeaways from the lithium criticality paper in terms of what we need to do moving forward?
The paper boils it down to two major findings. First, while the supply and demand for lithium seem okay right now, there's a real risk of long-term supply shortages. And second, the very things we need to do to meet our climate targets, like shifting to electric vehicles, could actually make those lithium shortages worse.
It's a tough balancing act.
It is. We need to find ways to decarbonize transportation without creating a lithium crisis.
What specific policy goals does the lithium criticality paper recommend?
They say we need to focus on a few key things. First, we need to develop and promote transportation systems that don't rely so heavily on individually owned cars. Things like better public transportation, shared ride services, even encouraging people to bike or walk more. Basically, reducing the overall number of vehicles on the road.
So it's about changing how we move around.
Exactly. Second, they emphasize the importance of building really efficient global recycling systems for lithium-ion batteries. That means capturing as much lithium as possible from those old batteries and putting it back into the system.
Closing the loop.
Right. Third, they say we need to keep pushing the boundaries of battery technology. We need batteries that are more energy dense, meaning they can store more energy in the same space, and batteries that last even longer.
So getting more mileage out of each battery.
Precisely. And finally, they say we need to explore new types of batteries, maybe even new battery chemistries altogether, that don't rely on lithium, or even look at alternative transportation technologies that might not need batteries at all.
So diversifying our options.
Exactly. It's about not putting all our eggs in the lithium basket.
Now, it's interesting that the conclusions of this study seem to differ from some earlier studies on lithium availability. What do the authors say about that?
They think it's mainly because they've factored in the most recent data on EV adoption rates, the rapid improvements in battery technology, and those ambitious climate targets that many countries are now committed to. They say some earlier studies might have underestimated how quickly things are changing.
So the game has changed.
It has. And the lithium criticality paper also points out that while we might be able to find substitutes for lithium-ion batteries in stationary storage applications, the real driver of lithium demand is going to be electric vehicles. That's where the bulk of the lithium is going to go.
So the EV revolution is going to have a huge impact on lithium demand.
Absolutely. And the lithium criticality paper does acknowledge the potential of new battery technologies like lithium air batteries or lithium sulfur batteries, and even batteries based on other materials like aluminum, sodium, or magnesium. But they stress that those technologies are still in the early stages of development.
So they're not a quick fix.
Not really. They say the focus in the near term needs to be on recycling and making the most of the lithium we already have.
So we need a multi-pronged approach.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of lithium. And the lithium criticality paper makes it clear that lithium supply is going to be a critical factor in the transition to a cleaner energy future, especially in the transportation sector.
Yes, and the study's main takeaway is that the level of that criticality depends heavily on how quickly we adopt electric vehicles and how much lithium is actually available to extract. Even with optimistic resource estimates, we're likely to face constraints unless we make some significant changes.
So, for all of you listening, we hope this deep dive into the assessment of lithium criticality in the global energy transition and addressing policy gaps in transportation has shed some light on the crucial role that lithium plays in shaping our energy future. The good news is that the immediate supply seems manageable, but the long-term picture requires a more proactive approach. We need to rethink our transportation systems, embrace circular economy principles through robust recycling, push the boundaries of battery technology, and explore every avenue to ensure a sustainable and equitable energy transition.
I couldn't agree more. It's about seeing the bigger picture and recognizing that lithium is more than just a component in a battery. It's a key ingredient in building a more sustainable future.
And that brings us to our final thought for you to ponder. Considering the potential limitations on lithium supply that this research highlights, what truly game-changing solutions do you think will be essential in the coming decades? Will we see breakthroughs in battery technology, a shift towards completely different energy storage solutions, or perhaps the fundamental rethinking of our transportation systems? This lithium criticality paper provides a crucial framework for understanding the challenges, but the solutions are still being written. We encourage you to explore the supplementary materials that accompany this research and stay tuned to the exciting developments that are happening in this vital field.